protesters and politicians have been calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza.
Ceasefire. Full stop.
For the sake of humanity, for the sake of dignity.
The United Nations passed a resolution for an immediate ceasefire, aiming to bring an end to the war.
Vote to stop the killing.
However, is a ceasefire really the solution? Typically, a ceasefire serves two key objectives. The first is to halt the war itself, lay down the weapons, and prevent escalation. The second is to establish a conducive environment for peace negotiations. In 2005, Israel conducted a complete withdrawal of both civilian and military presence in the Gaza Strip. This significant action, commonly known as the disengagement, resulted in the transfer of control over Gaza to the Palestinian Authority. In 2006, Hamas emerged victorious in the democratic elections of the Palestinian Authority. Following unsuccessful attempts to form a unity government with Fatah, Hamas won the elections again in 2007. After another failed attempt to create a stable government, Hamas forcibly seized control over Gaza, violently eliminating their political opponents within the Strip. Ever since Hamas gained control over Gaza, it has persistently instigated attacks on Israel by indiscriminately firing rockets into civilian areas, with the intention of inflicting maximum destruction and casualties.
Look at this, the fucking rocket.
This was often followed by an Israeli counterstrike and eventually a ceasefire. Whenever a ceasefire was declared, Hamas took advantage of the situation to expand their arsenal and rearm themselves.
We have just had a massive barrage of rockets coming in here.
Hamas repeatedly violated the ceasefire agreements with Israel by persistently launching rockets at Israeli civilians and initiate another cycle of conflict. In June 2008, Hamas and Israel entered into a 6-month ceasefire agreement.
In the coming days and weeks, the durability of the ceasefire will certainly be tested.
During this period, Hamas repeatedly launched rockets towards the city of Sderot. Just a day prior to the official end of the ceasefire, Hamas fired over 60 rockets towards Israel. In response, Israel carried out Operation Cast Lead.
Reports now on the escalating violence between Israel and Hamas.
After 3 weeks of intense fighting, a ceasefire was declared. In November of 2012, during a partial ceasefire that had been in place since March of that year, Hamas initiated an attack on Israeli soldiers who were guarding the border with Gaza. In response, Israel launched an attack targeting Hamas tunnels that infiltrated Israeli territories.
At about 45 feet below ground, it begins in the southern Gazan city of Khan Yunis and ends here, near an Israeli kibbutz along the border with Gaza.
Subsequently, numerous rockets and artillery were fired towards Israeli cities. In retaliation, Israel carried out the Pillar of Defense operation, which lasted for 8 days. For over 2 years, there wasn't a major conflict in the area until June 2014.
They are abducted in the dark of night. One manages to make this call for help.
3 Israeli teenagers were abducted and killed by Hamas terrorists. Several months later, the IDF successfully located and neutralized the 2 perpetrators. In retaliation, Hamas unleashed intense artillery fire on Israel.
The sun is coming up here in Gaza, and with it, many questions about the size of the operation Israel is planning on carrying out here in Gaza in the coming days and possibly longer.
Israel responded with Operation Protective Edge that spanned 7 weeks and concluded with a mutual ceasefire that was broken by Hamas again shortly after. This pattern has persisted to this day. Hamas initiates attacks on Israel, followed by an Israeli counterstrike, and eventually a ceasefire, and the cycle continues. The attacks on October 7th were unprecedented and marked a significant escalation in the conflict and can be considered the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Hamas broke the existing ceasefire that lasted over a year since August 2022 by murdering over 1,200 civilians in their homes and taking 240 innocent civilians hostage. As we're recording this voiceover, most of them are still being held within the Gaza Strip. Children, infants, women, and the elderly. Those attacks were followed by an Israeli counterstrike in Gaza, which we see unfolding today. It is worth noting that no peace negotiations took place between Hamas and Israel while the ceasefires were in effect. This is primarily due to Hamas's official charter, which explicitly states their aim of destroying Israel.
إسرائيل دولة لا مقام لها على أرضنا. إحنا الدولة لابد أن نزيلها.
كل الأراضي الفلسطينية يعني زوال إسرائيل.
طبعا.
Calling for a complete ceasefire now will only cause more rounds of fighting, thus spinning the cycle again. In recent weeks, protesters and politicians have been calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza.
The ceasefire.
Ceasefire. Full stop.
For the sake of humanity, for the sake of dignity.
The United Nations passed a resolution for an immediate ceasefire, aiming to bring an end to the war.
Vote to stop the killing.
However, is a ceasefire really the solution?